They said the sisters were born holding hands, 2 breaths, 1 heartbeat. By the time they were 16, the Brackley plantation had already decided which one was meant to be seen and which one was meant to be silent. When the master bought them, he gave one a name and the other a collar. They looked identical, but one was taught to sing at the piano while the other was ordered to serve. And when visitors came, the master's guests marveled at the twin who never spoke. They called her the Shadow. But no one knew what the silent one saw behind the doors of that house, or what promise the sisters made to each other the night before the master's wedding, when one was chosen to wear lace and the other was told to disappear. Louisiana, 1846. This isn't a ghost story, it's a story about how love can be split in half and what happens when the half that's left decides to remember. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. And tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? Now, let's go back. Louisiana, 1846. To a house that wanted only one voice and a mirror that learned the sound of 2. They came into the world the way thunder follows lightning, one scream, then another right behind it. Clara and Seline were born in the back room of the quarters, their mother clutching both until her arms trembled. The midwife said she'd never seen 2 babies look so alike. Same hair, same dimples, same small mark above the left collarbone, as if God had signed them twice by mistake. Their mother, Dinah, whispered it was a blessing. The overseer said it was bad luck. 2 mouths, same belly, he muttered. They'll take more than they give. But the girls grew quiet. They never cried for long. If one started, the other stopped, as if they traded sound between them. When they were old enough to walk, they followed each other like reflections, their steps matching, their shadows always touching. By the time they turned 10, the plantation wives would stop to stare when they carried water from the well. They looked like angels, one woman said. The master's son only grinned. Not angels, he said. Mirrors. That word stuck. By 15, Seline had learned to sing, soft, trembling hymns when she thought no one was listening. Clara never sang. She just watched her sister, mouthing the words in silence, her lips forming every line. Dinah said they were bound by something bigger than blood. When one breathes, she said, the other feels it. But in 1846, after the old master died, the estate fell into debt. The new owner, Mr. Harlan Brackley, came from St. Mary Parish, a man known for fine manners and quiet punishments. He wore white gloves even when the heat split the air, and he smiled too long when he spoke. He arrived one afternoon in a carriage drawn by grey horses, asking for the twin girls. When he saw them, he didn't speak for a full minute. Then he said, "I'll take them both." "They'll do nicely," Dinah begged him not to separate them. "They don't know how to be apart," she said. Brackley's smile didn't move. "I don't intend to separate them," he said. "They'll stay together. One will serve, the other will learn." That night, Dinah sat between her daughters, combing their hair by candlelight. She told them to always remember who they were, even if someone tried to make them forget. Seline nodded. Clara didn't. She just stared at the flame, her reflection dancing in her sister's eyes. When the carriage came at dawn, they climbed inside, hand in hand. The driver said he'd never seen 2 girls sit so still, so silent. One stared out the window, the other stared at her, and as the wheels rolled toward the Brackley plantation, the wind carried the faintest hum. 2 notes, almost the same, fading into one. The Brackley plantation was unlike any place the twins had seen. The air itself seemed to hum there, thick with jasmine and rot. The main house sat high on a hill, pale as bone, its windows long and narrow like eyes that never closed. When the carriage stopped, a servant opened the door. Seline stepped out first, clutching Clara's hand. The master followed, his boots sinking slightly into the soft dirt. "Welcome home," he said. He said it as if they should be grateful. Inside, everything smelled of polish and stillness. The hall was lined with portraits, pale faces framed in gold, and everywhere there were mirrors, small ones, large ones, oval and square, hanging from the walls like watchful ghosts. Each time the girls passed one, their reflections multiplied until it felt as if the whole house was filled with versions of them, all staring back in silence. Brackley's housekeeper, a sharp-faced woman named Mrs. Doss, led them upstairs. "You'll keep your mouths shut unless spoken to," she said. "Master don't care for noise. One of you's to serve in the parlour, the other'll tend to her." Seline looked confused. "Tend to who?" Mrs. Doss gave a small, cold smile. "To you, girl. He says you're the clever one, the talker. You'll learn the piano, the proper way to speak, to sit, to smile. You'll be seen." She turned to Clara. "And you, he says you're to be quiet. You'll shadow your sister, do what she does, but you won't speak unless told." Clara didn't answer. She looked down at her shoes, coated in red dust. That night, they were given a small attic room with a single bed. They lay side by side, unable to sleep. The air was so heavy it felt like it could press them flat. "What if I forget to be the clever one?" Seline whispered. "You won't," Clara said. Her sister turned toward her. "And if you forget to be quiet?" Clara smiled faintly in the dark. "Then we'll both remember." But neither of them knew what remembering would cost. The next morning, Mrs. Doss brought a dress of pale blue satin and a coarse linen gown. "For the house girl," she said, handing the satin to Seline, "and for her shadow." She tossed the linen dress at Clara's feet. As Seline changed, Clara helped fasten the buttons down her sister's back. Their hands brushed, one trembling, one still. In the mirror by the wall, they looked the same again, until Seline smiled. The reflection broke its symmetry. When they went downstairs, Master Brackley was waiting by the piano. He gestured toward it, his white gloves gleaming in the lamplight. "You'll play," he said to Seline, "and you—" His eyes lingered on Clara. "We'll stand behind her. I like the way your quiet fills the room." Then he leaned close, lowering his voice to a whisper. "A perfect reflection should never speak." Each morning began with the same sound, the piano, soft and halting at first, then steady like footsteps finding rhythm. Seline sat at the keys in her pale dress, while Master Brackley stood behind her, tapping her shoulder each time she missed a note. Clara watched from the corner, her linen skirt dusted with chalk and candle ash. At first, Brackley made her stand still. Then he told her to move when Seline did. "You'll follow her," he said. "Mirror her hands, her posture, her breath. The two of you will teach the house what beauty looks like." Seline tried to laugh. "But sir, no mirror plays piano." Brackley's face didn't change. "Then you'll be the first." After that, lessons stretched long into the afternoons. Seline learned waltzes, hymns, and small talk. Clara learned stillness. When her sister smiled, she smiled. When her sister blinked, she blinked. They began to breathe at the same pace, until even Mrs. Doss muttered that she couldn't tell which girl was which when the light went low. At night, Clara would rub her sore hands and whisper to Seline, "I can still feel the keys." "You don't have to do it so perfectly," her sister said once. "He can't see everything." But Clara shook her head. "He does." Brackley had a way of appearing without sound. He'd linger in the parlour doorway or by the stairwell, gloved hands clasped behind his back, watching the twins as if waiting for one of them to make a mistake. He began calling them Echo and Voice. The servants soon followed. When he called, "Voice," Seline answered. When he called, "Echo," Clara stepped forward, silent, obedient, her eyes lowered. One afternoon, during a tea service, a guest mistook Clara for her sister and asked her name. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could answer, Brackley's hand gripped her shoulder. "She doesn't speak," he said smoothly. "She listens." The room fell quiet. Clara nodded once, as if to prove him right. That night, Seline sat up in bed, her face pale in the moonlight. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked. "Why let him make you less?" Clara turned on her side. "Because that's what he wants." Seline frowned. "And if he wants you gone?" Clara looked at her sister for a long moment, then whispered, "Then he'll lose both of us." Below their window, crickets screamed against the thick Louisiana night. The world outside went on, the fields, the voices, the restless wind. Inside, the house slept under its own silence, the kind that feels alive, the kind that listens back. And for the first time since arriving, Clara dreamt of nothing, not of faces or mirrors or her sister's hands at the keys. Only the stillness remained, the same stillness the master loved. By the end of summer, the house had grown used to the twins' quiet rhythm. Guests came and went, merchants, planters, preachers, all curious about the Brackley sisters, though everyone in the parish knew they weren't sisters at all. They'd gather in the parlour to watch Seline play and sip their wine while the silent one, Clara, stood just behind, still as a carved figure, her shadow merging with her sister's. Brackley liked to sit in his chair by the hearth, gloved fingers steepled under his chin. He'd watch them for hours. Sometimes he'd nod for Clara to move an inch closer or tell Seline to slow her tempo to let the shadow catch up. Every command seemed part of something he was arranging in his head, a portrait that never quite satisfied him. He began giving them new rules. Seline would practice words, reciting poems, prayers, small, polite phrases, while Clara mimed them in silence. "You will speak," he told Seline. "You will understand," he told Clara. "The world needs both." One evening, after the guests left, he dismissed everyone but the twins. The air smelled of candle wax and sweat. Brackley stood by the mirror above the piano. "Come here," he said. They obeyed. He looked at their reflections, not at them. "Do you know why people stare at you?" Seline shook her head. "Because sameness frightens them," he said softly. "It reminds them how easily a soul can be copied." He turned to Clara. "But you are pure reflection." No voice, no rebellion. "You let the world decide what you are." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's real beauty." Celine's voice trembled. "She's not a reflection, sir. She's my sister." His expression froze. He stepped forward, closing the space between them. "Then let her prove she's different." He motioned to the piano. "Play something." Seline sat at the bench, hands shaking. "She doesn't play," she said. "Then teach her." The silence thickened. Seline shifted aside. Clara took the seat, her fingers hovering over the keys. The master nodded. "Go on." Clara pressed one note, then another. Her hands moved slower than memory, but something old stirred in her wrists, the same rhythm she'd mimed for months. When she finished, the sound faded into the crackle of the fire. Brackley smiled, thin and satisfied. "Now tell me," he said to Seline, "who played better?" Seline looked at her twin. The answer caught in her throat. "Say it," he murmured. "She did." Louder. "She did!" The echo of her voice filled the room. Brackley clapped once sharply. "Then we know which sister deserves to be heard." When he left, Seline sat frozen on the bench, tears streaking her face. Clara reached for her hand, but Seline pulled away. The parlour's candlelight flickered against the mirror, casting two shapes that seemed to move on their own. One breathing heavy, one still. That night, Clara didn't sleep. She watched her sister's back and whispered, "He's trying to make us forget which one we are." And in the dark, Seline whispered back, "Maybe he already has." By autumn, the master's fascination with the twins had grown into spectacle. He began inviting guests every Sunday, planters, widows, and travelling men, to witness what he called the parlour performance. At dusk, Mrs. Doss would light every candle in the house until the parlour glowed like a chapel. The twins were dressed alike, pale dresses, hair parted down the middle, small ribbons at their throats. Seline took her place at the piano, while Clara stood behind her, hands resting on the back of the bench, eyes fixed on the keys. The guests whispered as they entered. "Which one's which?" they'd murmur. "Does the quiet one understand?" Brackley loved the confusion. He'd smile, leaning against the mantel with his glass of whiskey, saying, "Watch closely. You'll see Seline would play slow hymns, her fingers trembling, her reflection caught in the polished wood of the piano." Clara's lips moved soundlessly with each note, mirroring her sister's breath, her rhythm, her slight tilt of the head. It was flawless, so perfect it began to unsettle the audience. The more silent Clara became, the more alive Seline seemed, as if her sister's silence fed her music. By the final note, the guests would applaud, unsure whether to look at the girl who played or the one who didn't. Afterward, the master would pour himself another drink and say, "You see?" One voice, one echo. "That's order." That night, Seline cried quietly into her pillow. Clara sat beside her, brushing her hair back. "I can't breathe when he watches me," Seline whispered. "He makes me feel like I'm playing for my own ghost." Clara didn't answer. She just looked down at her hands, hands that moved like her sister's, hands that could play but weren't allowed to. The next morning, Mrs. Doss came to their room with a folded piece of lace and a gold pin. "Master says this is for the one who speaks," she said, tossing the bundle toward Seline. "He likes the way you look when you wear white." Then she turned to Clara. "He says your shadow's gotten too dark. Best stay out of the light for a while." For 3 days, Clara wasn't called to the parlour. She worked in the back rooms, scrubbing floors and polishing silver until her reflection glared back from every surface. When she finally returned, she found Seline at the piano again, alone this time. The master stood nearby, adjusting her posture, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Clara froze in the doorway. Brackley glanced up. "Ah," he said, "the echo returns." Celine's hands faltered on the keys. He gestured to Clara. "You've been quiet even for yourself. I was beginning to think your silence had turned into something useful." Seline turned toward her sister, eyes wide. Clara forced a faint smile. "I was only learning how to listen better, sir." Brackley studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Good," he said softly. "A mirror that learns to listen will one day learn to lie." The air in the Brackley house grew heavy as summer turned to ash-grey winter. The two sisters, still dressed alike, still walked side by side, but something small and sharp had settled between them, like a splinter under skin. It didn't show, not at first. It lived in the pauses. In the way Seline hesitated before reaching for Clara's hand, in how Clara lingered a second too long by the mirror before joining her sister at the piano. Seline had begun to speak differently. The housekeeper called it refinement. She said Celine's voice now carried like a lady's. Her laughter was quieter, more deliberate. She no longer whispered secrets to Clara when they were alone. "Master says I must speak clearly," Seline said one night, fastening the gold pin to her dress. "He says the house listens." Clara, sitting at the edge of the bed, stared at her hands. "And what does it hear?" Seline turned toward the mirror, her reflection brighter than the lamplight behind her. "It hears what he wants it to." The next morning, Clara was told to help serve breakfast. It wasn't unusual. She often waited at the table while Brackley ate in silence. But that morning, Seline was already seated beside him, dressed in pale yellow, her hair braided with ribbons. Brackley looked up as Clara entered. "Fetch the coffee," he said. Then, after a pause, "And don't speak unless spoken to." Clara nodded. She moved quietly across the floor, each step measured. When she reached the sideboard, she felt his gaze on her, heavy, assessing. "You two have the same hands," he said finally. Seline smiled faintly. "We were born the same, sir." "Born the same," Brackley repeated, "but only one was meant to be seen." He turned his eyes to Clara. "Do you agree?" Clara didn't answer. He rose from his chair, stepping closer. "You may nod if you do." Still, she stood motionless. A quiet tension filled the room, the kind that makes every breath sound too loud. Brackley leaned forward. "Say it," he whispered. Seline reached out. "Sir, she doesn't—" "Quiet," he snapped. For a moment, the only sound was the slow crackle of the fire. Then Clara spoke, her voice rough but steady. "You said I wasn't allowed." Brackley's eyes narrowed. Seline gasped. "Clara," but the master smiled, slow and unsettling. "So you do have a voice." He turned to Seline. "Perhaps silence is wasted on the wrong twin." That evening, Brackley called for only one girl to play the piano. It wasn't Seline. From the attic, Seline listened to the muffled notes below, each one slow, uneven, uncertain. Clara's hands trembled, but she kept playing until the keys felt warm beneath her fingers. When she finished, Brackley said nothing. He only nodded once, as if to a student who had finally learned what obedience sounds like. In the stillness that followed, the house felt smaller, as though it too was holding its breath, waiting to see which sister would speak next. The day Brackley separated them, the house went quiet in a way it never had before. The air felt thick with something unsaid. Seline woke to find her sister's side of the bed cold. The small comb they shared was gone. So was Clara's linen dress. Mrs. Doss appeared at the door before she could ask. "The master's orders," she said. "One twin in the attic, one in the parlour. He says the mirror's been looking too crowded." Seline stood there, bare feet against the cold floorboards, her stomach hollowing. "But we belong together," she said. Mrs. Doss's mouth twitched, something like pity, something like satisfaction. "Belonging don't mean much in this house, girl. Best get dressed. He's waiting." That morning, Seline sat at the piano, but her fingers wouldn't move. She kept glancing toward the door, expecting Clara to appear. She didn't. The only reflection in the polished wood now was her own. Brackley entered, carrying a book of hymns. "Play," he said. Her voice came out small. "I can't, sir. Not without—" "Without what?" he asked, stepping closer. She swallowed hard. "Without her." He smiled faintly, that slow, polished smile that made every word feel like a trick. "Then learn." He placed his hand over hers, forcing her fingers down onto the keys. The sound was ugly, a broken chord that shivered through the air. "There," he said. "That's what freedom sounds like." Upstairs, Clara listened to the same note echo through the ceiling. She could almost feel her sister's touch on the keys. Her room was small and bare, the only light coming from a narrow window overlooking the cane fields. On the wall, someone had left an old mirror, its surface spotted, cracked, the glass warped so her reflection looked twisted, incomplete. She stared into it until the edges blurred. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and pressed it against the cold glass. The warped reflection raised its hand too, but not quite in time. For the first time, Clara didn't feel like the one inside the mirror. She felt like the one looking in. That night, Brackley called for her again. "The quiet one," Mrs. Doss said. "He wants you in the parlour." When Clara entered, her sister was already seated at the piano, hands trembling, eyes wet. Brackley stood beside her, his expression calm, almost gentle. "Let's see," he said softly, "if silence can teach speech." He motioned for Clara to stand behind Seline. "The reflection belongs where it's meant to be." Celine's shoulders shook. "Please, sir." "Let her go. Go." Brackley's tone hardened. "No, she'll stay until she learns her place." He turned toward Clara, eyes gleaming. "You remember, don't you?" Behind her. Always behind her, Clara nodded, her throat burning. As Seline began to play, the melody stumbled, collapsing under the weight of its own echo. Brackley's hand tightened on her shoulder. "Play properly," he hissed. When the final note faded, Clara met her sister's reflection in the piano's lacquered surface. Both faces looked the same, haunted, hollow, and unsure which one was still real. The house didn't change, but Clara did. Something in her had hardened, not anger, not yet, but a stillness that no longer felt like submission. It was the quiet of someone who'd learned how to listen too well and started to hear what wasn't meant for her. From the attic, she could hear every sound that drifted through the floorboards, the master's footsteps pacing the hall, the soft cry of her sister's songs, the scrape of Mrs. Doss's broom across the parlour floor. The house spoke in small noises, and Clara began to understand its language. When she was called downstairs again, she didn't look at Seline right away. She bowed her head, hands clasped, waiting for Brackley's orders. "Your sister says you've grown distant," he said, "that you no longer respond when she speaks." Clara kept her eyes on the rug. "You told me not to speak unless spoken to, sir." Brackley smiled. "Ah, so obedience is your language now." "Yes, sir." He circled her slowly, his gloved hands folded behind his back. "And if I told you to sing?" Her breath caught. "I'd try, sir." He leaned close, voice almost tender. "Good. Because silence without purpose is wasteful." He dismissed her, and she turned to leave. But as she passed the piano, Brackley caught her wrist. "Tell me, Clara, does your sister know how to listen as well as you do?" She didn't answer. When she returned to their room that night, Seline was waiting. "He's changing you," she said quietly. "I can see it." Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "Maybe he's changing both of us." Celine's voice cracked. "You think this is choice?" "You think if you're quiet enough, he'll stop." Clara looked up, her eyes darker than before. "No, I think if I'm quiet enough, he won't see what I'm doing." Seline frowned. "What are you doing?" "Learning." In the weeks that followed, Clara's silence grew deliberate. She began to move differently, not like a servant, but like someone observing. She memorized the way Brackley's keys hung by the door, how the parlour window latch clicked twice before it opened, the rhythm of the house's routines. One night, she crept from her attic room after everyone slept. The corridor was dark, lined with portraits whose eyes followed her in the candlelight. She moved barefoot, slow, until she reached the parlour. The piano sat in the half-light, its lid open, waiting. Clara sat at the bench. Her fingers hovered, then pressed down. A single note. Soft, then another. Then another. Upstairs, Seline stirred. She heard the faint melody rise through the floorboards, their old song, the one they used to hum before they were sold. She rose and stood barefoot on the cold floor, tears stinging her eyes. For the first time, she didn't know whether the sound was coming from her sister's hands or from her own memory. And downstairs, Clara played. Not for the master, not for anyone, just to remind the house it didn't own every silence yet. By the next morning, the parlour still smelled faintly of smoke and candle wax, though no fire had been lit. Mrs. Doss found the piano keys dusted with ash and muttered about restless air. She told the master someone had been downstairs in the night. Brackley only smiled. "The house keeps its own hours," he said. But later, when he saw Clara sweeping the hall, his eyes lingered. That afternoon, he asked Seline to play. She sat before the piano, hands trembling. The room was crowded with the master's guests again, men with waistcoats too tight, women with fans that flicked like wings. They spoke softly, as if afraid to disturb something sleeping in the corners. When Seline began, her fingers faltered. The melody refused to settle. From the far end of the room, Clara watched. Her face gave nothing away, but her reflection in the piano's wood looked alive. Eyes bright, lips moving with each note, as if she, not her sister, controlled the rhythm. One guest leaned toward Brackley and whispered, "How does she know when to follow?" Brackley didn't look away from the twins. "She listens." When the music stopped, the applause came too slow. Brackley dismissed the guests with a polite nod. Then, when the room was empty, he turned toward Clara. "You were awake last night," he said. Clara froze. The servants heard it. The piano. The song. Celine's eyes widened. "Sir, Brackley raised a hand. "Not you." He stepped closer to Clara. "Do you have something to tell me?" She shook her head. "Look at me." Clara did. For a moment, neither spoke. Her silence filled the space between them like another person. Brackley exhaled, almost amused. "You've changed. When I first brought you here, you were soft. Now you stand there like you've forgotten what you are." He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't make me remind you." Then he turned to Seline. "Take your sister upstairs. I don't want to see her until she remembers her place." Seline led Clara out by the wrist. When they reached their room, she slammed the door shut and spun around. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "He'll hurt you." Clara's voice was calm. "He won't." "You don't know him. I do now." Seline sat down hard on the edge of the bed, shaking. "You think silence makes you safe, but it's killing us." Clara knelt in front of her. "Silence isn't my cage anymore," she said softly. "It's his." That night, while the house slept, the wind carried faint music again, not from the piano this time, but from the walls. A low hum, steady and human, like a song sung without sound, the kind that lingers after breath has left the body. Seline heard it from her pillow and pressed her hands to her ears. It didn't stop. It moved through the plaster, through the floorboards, until it felt like the house itself was learning to remember the tune. The days that followed felt longer, stretched thin like old lace. The Brackley house had fallen into a rhythm of whispers and footsteps, as if every room were waiting for something to break. Brackley stopped hosting guests. He spent most of his hours in the parlour, pacing before the piano, his gloved fingers brushing across the keys without pressing them. Sometimes he'd pause and stare at the faint smudges on the ivory, as though the prints themselves were taunting him. He began calling for Clara more often, though he rarely spoke to her directly. He'd have her stand in corners or beside mirrors as he read or wrote letters. Sometimes he'd ask questions, then forbid her to answer. "Do you understand loyalty?" he'd ask. Then, before she could move, he'd say, "No words." He'd study her silence like a riddle he couldn't solve. One evening, while Clara stood behind his chair, Brackley said quietly, "Your sister says you hum when you work." "Is that true?" Clara said nothing. He turned his head slightly. "What tune do you hum?" Still nothing. The silence deepened. Then Brackley laughed, soft and unsteady. "You think I can't hear it, don't you? You think I don't know what you're doing?" Seline, watching from the doorway, froze. Her heart thudded against her ribs. Brackley rose slowly from his chair. "You play when I'm not here," he said. "You wake the house with your soundless songs. I can feel it when I sleep." Clara didn't look up. He stepped closer. "You mock me." "No, sir." The words were barely audible, but they hit him like a slap. He stared at her mouth as though he'd seen something unnatural. Seline hurried forward. "She didn't mean—" "Quiet!" Brackley turned on her. "You defend her too easily." "I should have known. There's no difference between you anymore." He pointed toward the piano. "One of you will play, the other will watch. I'll see if I can tell which one's which." Seline sat down, trembling. Clara stood behind her, the familiar arrangement restored. Brackley's eyes flicked between them, waiting for some sign of rebellion. "Begin." Celine's fingers moved shakily across the keys. The melody stuttered, faltered. Behind her, Clara's reflection swayed, lips parting in time with the rhythm. It was small, but Brackley saw it. "Stop!" Celine's hands froze mid-air. Brackley slammed his palm on the lid. "She's playing you like a puppet," he shouted. "Even when you move, it's her shadow that leads." Seline flinched. Clara stood motionless. For a long time he said nothing. Then, slowly, he smiled. "If silence won't obey me," he said softly, "perhaps I'll teach the voice to forget how to speak." That night, Seline didn't come to bed. Mrs. Doss said the master had ordered her to stay in the east wing to practice alone. From the attic, Clara sat awake, listening for footsteps, for a song, for anything at all. But the house stayed silent, except for one faint sound beneath the floorboards. A heartbeat, slow, stubborn, and not yet ready to stop. For 3 days, the house was silent. Not the ordinary silence that settled after supper or during storms. This one was heavy, swollen, as if every wall were holding its breath. Seline didn't come upstairs. Mrs. Doss brought trays to the east wing and returned with them untouched. "She ain't eating," she muttered to Clara. "Master says it's fasting. I say it's mourning." Then she lowered her voice. "Don't go near her. You'll make it worse." But Clara couldn't stay away. That night, when the house had gone dark, she slipped from the attic. Her bare feet barely touched the boards as she crept down the narrow stairs. The east wing smelled of damp linen and lamp oil. The door to Celine's room was closed, but light leaked through the crack at the bottom. She knocked softly. "It's me." A moment passed, then the faint scrape of the latch. Seline stood in the doorway, thinner than before, her eyes hollow. The ribbon from her dress hung loose around her neck. "He doesn't let me sleep," she whispered. "He says my silence offends him." Clara stepped inside. The piano stool sat overturned in the corner. Pages of sheet music lay torn across the floor. "What's he done to you?" Clara asked. Seline smiled weakly. "He's trying to make me perfect." They sat together on the edge of the bed, the candlelight trembling. Celine's voice cracked. "He says if I don't learn obedience, he'll sell you. He says he's tired of two faces staring back at him. He wants only one." Clara's breath caught. "He won't. He will." Celine's eyes filled. "I told him I'd do anything. I begged him. I told him I'd learn to sing louder, talk softer, anything to keep you here." Clara reached for her sister's hand, but Seline pulled away. "Don't touch me," she whispered. "He'll smell you on me." For the first time, Clara felt something break that silence couldn't fix. The next morning, when Brackley summoned her, Clara didn't bow her head. She met his eyes. "You've been wandering at night," he said. "No, sir." He smiled thinly. "I can smell the candle wax on your hands." He circled her, slow, patient. "I should send you away. But I think you'd like that too much." Clara said nothing. "Instead," he continued, "you'll take her place today. You'll sit at the piano and you'll play until your fingers remember who you belong to." She obeyed. She sat where her sister had sat, the bench still warm. Her hands hovered over the keys. The silence in the room felt alive, breathing just behind her. Then she began to play. The first note cracked the air. The second shook the dust from the curtains. By the fifth, Brackley was no longer smiling. When she finished, she stood, bowed her head slightly, and said quietly, "Now you know who remembers." Brackley's hand trembled as he reached for his glass. "You'll regret that, girl." But as Clara left the room, she wasn't sure she would. By the next morning, everyone in the house knew what Clara had done. The kitchen girls whispered that the quiet twin had defied the master, that she'd played his piano as if the devil himself were guiding her hands. Mrs. Doss crossed herself when Clara passed, muttering, "That one's got thunder sitting behind her ribs." Brackley didn't summon her that day, or the day after. He stayed in his study, pacing. Servants said he spoke aloud to no one. "Talking to his ghosts," someone whispered, or maybe just his mirror. Clara kept working, washing, sweeping, carrying trays, as if nothing had changed. But her silence was different now. It wasn't meek. It was deliberate, alive. Every quiet glance, every careful movement seemed to test how far she could push before the house snapped back. When she went upstairs to deliver linens, she passed Celine's door. A muffled sound drifted through, not crying, not singing, something in between. She knocked. "It's me." No answer. She opened the door slowly. Seline sat by the window, staring out at the fields. Her face looked older, drawn tight, like cloth left too long in the sun. "I heard you played," she said without turning. Clara hesitated. "He made me." Seline let out a short, bitter laugh. "He makes us both. That's all he ever does." "I wasn't playing for him," Clara said softly. "Then who?" "For us." Seline finally turned, eyes glinting. "For us? You think your rebellion saves me? You think your silence makes you holy?" Clara stepped closer. "You're angry at the wrong person." "I'm angry because you're still pretending we're the same," Seline snapped. "You think your quiet means control, but it's just another kind of cage." Clara's throat tightened. "At least I chose it." "No," Seline whispered. "You survived it." There's a difference. They stood there, the light from the window cutting the room in half. One sister in shadow, one in sun. For the first time since they were children, they looked like two separate people. Seline rose and crossed the room. She touched Clara's face gently, as though testing if she was real. "Do you ever think," she said, voice trembling, "that maybe he's right? That maybe there's only one of us?" Clara caught her hand and pressed it against her chest. "Then let me be the one who remembers." The door creaked open behind them. Mrs. Doss stood in the doorway, eyes sharp. "Master says neither of you are to leave this wing. You're to stay together until he calls." She shut the door hard, the sound echoing through the hall. Seline sank back into the chair, her hand still resting on her sister's. "He's trying to erase us," she said. Clara looked toward the window, where the fields shone pale under the sun. "Then we'll have to haunt him while we're still alive." The night Brackley called them down again, the sky was the color of lead. Thunder rolled somewhere far away, but the air inside the house didn't move. Mrs. Doss found the twins sitting on the attic floor and told them to come at once. "He wants both of you," she said, "and he don't sound himself." When they entered the parlour, every lamp had been lit. The piano gleamed like a wet stone. Brackley stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, the other holding a small glass of brandy. His gloves were gone. His fingers, pale and shaking, left sweat marks on the wood. "You've both forgotten your places," he said quietly, "and I intend to remind you." Neither sister spoke. He gestured toward the piano. "Sit." They obeyed, Seline at the keys, Clara just behind her. "For months," he said, pacing behind them, "I tried to make you one thing. One song, one reflection. But you," his voice wavered, "you turned it into mockery. You've made my house echo with lies." He stepped in front of them and pointed at Clara. "You will speak when I tell you to. You will repeat what your sister says, word for word. Do you understand?" Clara nodded. "Good." He turned to Seline. "Tell me what you are." Seline swallowed hard. "A servant, sir." "Now you," he said to Clara. Celine's eyes widened. "Don't," but Clara spoke, voice soft but clear. "A servant, sir." Brackley's jaw tightened. Louder. "A servant." "Again!" Clara's tone rose, trembling now. "A servant." The echo filled the room. For a heartbeat, it was impossible to tell which voice belonged to whom. Brackley smiled. "You see? The reflection always learns. Even a shadow can be taught to speak." He poured himself another drink, his movements jerky, careless. "Again," he said. "Say something worth repeating." Seline stared at him, her face pale with rage. "You'll never make her you." He leaned close, eyes bloodshot. "No," he said softly, "but I can make her you." Celine's breath caught. He gestured to the mirror above the mantel. "Look," he said. "Tell me, when you see yourselves there, which one is which?" They turned. Two identical figures stared back, one with tears streaming down her face, the other with eyes like still water. Seline spoke first. "I see my sister." "And you?" Brackley asked Clara. Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "I see what you made." The master's expression faltered. The glass in his hand slipped and shattered on the floor. "Get out," he said hoarsely. They didn't move. "Get out." The sound tore through the house like a storm. They ran up the stairs, breathless, the echo of his voice following. When they reached the attic, Seline sank against the wall, shaking. "What did you mean?" she whispered. "When you said that?" Clara didn't answer. She looked out the small window, the thunder closer now, the air thick with rain. "He's breaking," she said, "and when he does, we'll be the ones who decide what's left of him." That night, the wind began before the rain. It moaned through the shutters like something searching for a way inside. The lamps flickered, and each flicker made the shadows in the room seem to breathe. The twins sat side by side on the attic floor, listening. Every few seconds, thunder rolled closer. They could hear the house groan, the boards, the hinges, the glass, as if even the walls were tired of being quiet. Celine's hands trembled in her lap. "He'll call us again," she said. Clara didn't answer. She was staring at the small mirror on the wall. Its cracked surface split her reflection in two. "He can't call what doesn't come." Seline turned to her. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm done being an echo." The door creaked open then, and Mrs. Doss appeared holding a candle stub. Her face looked older than it had that morning. "He's asking for you both," she said. "Now." Seline rose first. "Is he drunk?" Mrs. Doss hesitated. "He's wrong." The parlour was dim when they entered. The fire had gone out, but the room was lit by lightning. Brackley stood beside the piano, bareheaded, his eyes glassy. The mirror above the mantel had been turned to face the wall. "I've been thinking," he said slowly. "Maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I misunderstood what God wanted from you." Seline swallowed. "Sir?" He smiled faintly. "He made you the same for a reason, didn't he? Two halves of one thing. Two vessels for one soul." Clara felt the air change. "Come here," he said. They obeyed. He placed a hand on each of their heads, his touch clammy, trembling. "You've both been fighting what you were meant to be. There's no need for that anymore." Lightning flashed outside, blinding white. The sound of rain crashed against the windows. "I've decided," he said softly. "The one who speaks will stay. The one who doesn't will be freed." Celine's voice broke. "Freed?" He smiled wider. "You'll see." Clara stepped back, her heart hammered in her chest. Brackley turned to her, his tone sharp now. "Where are you going?" She met his eyes. "You said you wanted silence." "I did." "Then listen." She turned toward the piano. Her fingers touched the keys, gentle, deliberate. The first note rang out like a heartbeat, then another, then a third. The melody was one he hadn't heard before, slow, uncertain, beautiful. Brackley's expression faltered. "What are you doing?" "Finishing what you started," she said. Thunder shook the walls. Rain bled through the cracks in the window frame. Seline watched her sister play, her breath catching at the sight, this soft defiance, this calm that didn't ask for permission. When the song ended, Clara rose and looked at the master. "You can't own a reflection," she said. He stared at her, jaw trembling. "You'll regret that." But outside, the storm had already taken the sky, and for the first time, the house didn't sound like it was holding its breath. It sounded like it was exhaling. The storm came down hard that night. Sheets of rain slapping the roof, wind tearing at the shutters. The plantation grounds disappeared beneath the dark. Inside, the air felt charged, like something was waiting to happen. Mrs. Doss had locked herself in the pantry. The field hands were huddled in the quarters, praying the roof would hold. But the master stayed awake. He roamed the halls barefoot, the tails of his shirt loose, his eyes red and unfocused. He stopped in front of the parlour door. The piano gleamed in the lightning flashes, slick with water that had leaked through the ceiling. The soundboard hummed softly, almost alive. He thought he heard someone playing. "Who's there?" he barked. No answer, only thunder. He staggered to the piano, slamming the lid down. The echo rang through the house like a gunshot. Upstairs, Clara jolted awake. She looked at Seline, who was sitting upright already, eyes wide. "He's gone mad," Seline whispered. Clara rose and lit the candle. "He's always been mad." They listened. The storm outside, the faint footsteps below, the restless creak of the floorboards. It all blended into one sound. "I'm going down there," Clara said. Seline grabbed her arm. "Don't, please. He'll hurt you. He already has." Celine's voice cracked. "Then let him hurt me instead." Clara turned to her, candlelight flickering across her face. "He already has." The words hung between them, heavier than thunder. They went together. The staircase trembled beneath their bare feet. Downstairs, the parlour door stood open, wind howling through the broken window panes. Brackley was there, drenched and wild-eyed, trying to right the piano, as if fixing it might make the storm stop. When he saw them, he smiled, not cruelly, but like a man seeing a vision. "There you are," he said. "One voice, one body. Just like it should be." He reached for them. Seline stepped in front of her sister. "Don't touch her." Brackley froze. "You defy your master." She straightened her shoulders. "You stopped being master when you started talking to mirrors." Lightning split the sky. In that moment, Clara saw the man not as a monster, but as something smaller, frightened, hollow, grasping at control like a drowning man clutching water. He lunged, and the candle went out. There was a crash, the piano tipping, glass shattering. Seline screamed. Clara's hands found the keys, slick with rain, and slammed them down, a single violent chord that filled the room. It was the loudest sound the house had ever heard. When the thunder answered, it shook the floorboards. Brackley slipped, falling backward into the mirror he'd turned to the wall. It shattered, scattering his reflection across the floor like pieces of another man's soul. The rain poured harder. The sisters stood there, breathing, the room spinning with echoes. Seline's voice broke the silence first. "What have we done?" Clara looked at the shards on the floor. "We've finished his song." Outside, the wind began to fade. The storm had finally broken, but inside the house, something else had only just begun. By dawn, the rain had thinned to a whisper. The house sat crouched under the grey sky, windows fogged, air heavy with smoke and damp. Every room smelled like the storm had passed through it and left its breath behind. Mrs. Doss was the first to find the master. He lay at the base of the mirror, shards glinting around him like frozen water. One arm twisted under his body, his eyes open but empty, the pale film already setting in. She screamed once, then covered her mouth, as if afraid the sound might wake him. Word spread fast. Servants gathered in the hallways, whispering, crossing themselves, watching the stairs as if the house might crumble without his weight in it. Clara and Seline came down together, their hands still linked. No one spoke to them. The faces around them looked frightened, not of what had happened, but of what might come next. Mrs. Doss's voice shook. He fell. Slipped, maybe. The mirror. She pointed, but couldn't finish. Seline looked at the shards scattered across the floor. She could see her reflection in every piece, 100 fragments of herself, none of them complete. Clara knelt beside the body. She didn't touch him. Her voice was steady when she finally spoke. "He was always looking for his reflection," she said. "Now he's part of it." No one moved. Outside, a soft wind moved through the wet cane fields, the sound of it low and endless, like a hymn without words. By afternoon, riders came from the parish to take account of the death. They found no family, no heir. The papers they carried called Brackley a man of refinement and Christian standing. None of them mentioned what he'd been here. The overseer told the servants they'd be sold off by month's end, the property cleared. Mrs. Doss began packing immediately. She didn't look at the sisters again. That evening, Clara stood on the porch. The field stretched out beneath a bruised sunset, rows of cane shining wet and red. Behind her, the house was quiet, but not empty, the kind of quiet that holds memory instead of air. Seline came to stand beside her. Her voice was small, cracked. "He's gone." Clara nodded. "So are we. We can't leave. Not yet. They'll come looking." Clara turned to her, eyes calm. "They'll find a story, a fall, an accident, whatever they want to believe, but not us, not what we were." The wind rose again, carrying the faint smell of wet ash. Seline looked toward the parlour window, where the piano still stood, its lid cracked open like a mouth mid-breath. "What happens now?" she whispered. Clara looked out over the fields. "Now," she said, "we make sure he doesn't get the last word." The last light of the sun touched the broken glass inside the house, and for a moment it looked like the mirror was breathing again, only this time it reflected no one at all. By the next sunrise, the air around the Brackley house was still again, too still. The storm had stripped the cane bare, flattening it in long streaks across the fields. The servants had scattered before dawn, some on foot, some in stolen wagons. No one looked back. Clara and Seline hadn't spoken since the night before. They sat on the back steps, watching the fog rise from the ground like breath from a wound. Seline's hands were clasped tight in her lap. "He's gone," she said. Her voice sounded brittle. "We should be too." Clara didn't answer. She was looking out toward the fields. "Run where?" "Anywhere. North, New Orleans." The river Clara shook her head slowly. "He owned us here. If we leave, they'll write his story for us. They'll call us the ones who killed him." Seline's eyes flashed. "We did." "No," Clara said, her voice soft but certain. "The house did." Seline turned to her sister. "You sound just like him." Clara stood. "No, I sound like the part of him that's still afraid." They went back inside. The hallways were damp, the portraits crooked. Water pooled beneath the piano, dripping through the cracked ceiling. Everything smelled of rain and iron. Mrs. Doss had left the master's study door open, papers scattered across the desk, letters half-written, half-burned. Clara picked one up. The handwriting was jagged, uneven, 2 souls, 1 reflection. One will obey, one will remember. Seline touched her sister's arm. "We should go." Clara's eyes drifted to the mirror on the floor. Cracked, but not shattered. Their faces looked back from it, doubled and strange. "You can go," Clara said, "but I won't leave this house to tell his story." Seline frowned. "And what story will you tell?" "The truth," Clara said. "That we were here, that we lived, that our silence wasn't his to own." Seline stepped closer. "And if they don't believe you?" Clara's expression didn't change. "Then they'll remember the silence instead." For a long time, they stood there, 2 figures reflected in a broken mirror. Finally, Seline whispered, "If I leave, I'll take your name." Clara nodded. "Then take it. Maybe it'll live longer in your mouth than it ever did in mine." Celine's eyes glistened. She pressed her forehead to her sister's. "And you?" "I'll stay." When she was gone, Clara sat at the piano. The light from the window fell across the keys. She placed her hands on them, not to play, just to feel the cold smoothness beneath her fingertips. Outside, the wind rose again, softer this time, like the house itself was breathing her name. Seline left before sunrise. The fields were wet and shining, a silver mist rising off the cane. She wore one of the master's old coats, too large at the shoulders, and carried a single satchel with bread, matches, and a strip of lace she'd torn from her sister's dress. She didn't look back at first. The house loomed behind her like a memory that hadn't decided whether to die or follow. When she finally turned, she saw a faint figure at the upper window. Clara, watching, her face unreadable behind the glass. Seline raised her hand once. The figure didn't move. Then the mist swallowed everything. Inside, Clara stood motionless for a long time. The room smelled of smoke and damp wood, and something faintly sweet, the way lilies smell when they've been left too long in the vase. She thought of the carriage that had brought them here years ago. 2 girls sitting close, holding hands, believing they were one life split between 2 bodies. Now there was only one left, and she wasn't sure which part she'd inherited, the living one or the remembering one. She went to the parlour. The piano still stood there, crooked from the fall, its strings humming softly in the draughts that slipped through the broken windows. She sat down and pressed a single key. The sound was warped but alive. She began to play. Slowly at first, then faster. Not the hymns Brackley had loved, but the song she and Seline used to hum as children, the one their mother said could make the world stop listening for a moment. Outside, the sound drifted through the open doors, out across the wet fields, into the morning air. It was carried by the wind that always seemed to return to this house, as if even storms couldn't quite forget it. By the time the sun cleared the mist, travellers on the road could hear faint music rising from the plantation, a melody without words, low and steady. Some said it sounded like grief, others said it sounded like peace. Seline walked until her feet bled. By the 3rd day, she reached the river. She traded her coat for passage with a ferryman who didn't ask questions. When he asked her name, she hesitated, then said, "Clara." He nodded, not knowing the difference. She watched the land fade behind her, the fields, the cypress, the long white house that would one day be nothing but ruin and rumour. The current pulled her forward, slow and certain. On the far bank, she looked back one last time. The horizon shimmered, the air thick with humidity and memory. Somewhere out there, she imagined her sister still playing, the sound finding her through the wind. She whispered into the river's breath, "Keep her safe." And as the boat drifted away, she thought she heard the faintest reply. One note, soft as a heartbeat, carried from the place she'd left behind. Years passed. The river changed its colour with every season, but Seline never returned to it. She found work in a river town south of Baton Rouge, washing clothes for a widow who didn't ask questions. She lived quiet, careful, and alone. She went by Clara Brackley now. The name drew no suspicion. There were too many broken houses, too many stories washed downstream for anyone to ask where one woman ended and another began. She'd grown thinner, her voice quieter, her face lined with the kind of grief that doesn't announce itself. When she looked into the basin water, she sometimes caught a reflection that didn't quite match the movement of her hands. At night, she'd hum to herself while folding the clean sheets. The widow once told her, "You sound like a church half buried." Seline only smiled. "It's not a song," she said. "It's a memory trying to stay warm." Every few months, travelers would bring news from the north, rumors about freed men, changing laws, plantations burning. But one story always made her blood run cold. The Brackley estate, still standing but empty, cursed with the sound of piano music that came and went with the wind. Some swore they'd seen a woman in white standing at the window, her head tilted as if listening to something far away. The locals called her the Echo Sister. Seline never corrected them. One winter she went to the market to buy candles. A preacher there was shouting about God's judgment on the unholy places of the south. When he mentioned the Brackley house by name, Seline froze. "Devil's work was done there," he said. "Two sisters born of sin, one killed the other, and now her soul walks the piano at night." The crowd murmured. Some crossed themselves. Seline felt her throat close. She wanted to scream that they were wrong, that the sin wasn't theirs but the man's, the one who'd owned them both like a mirror he could hang and rearrange, but the words stayed where they always had, behind her teeth. That night, she lit one of the candles she'd bought and set it on her windowsill. The flame flickered, steady against the dark. "Clara," she whispered. The name didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt shared. She closed her eyes and imagined the house, its hallways filling with dust, its piano untouched except by the wind. She saw her sister sitting there, still and patient, hands resting on the keys as if waiting for someone to return. The candle sputtered once, then steadied. "I'm coming back," she said softly. "Just once more." Outside, the wind shifted. It swept through the small town, curling around corners and shuttered doors, carrying with it a faint, familiar hum, a tune so fragile it could only belong to someone who refused to stop remembering. The road back to St. Mary Parish hadn't changed much in 10 years. The trees leaned low and twisted, their branches dipped in moss. The air smelled of wet bark and smoke from far-off fields burning off the last of last season's cane. Seline, still answering to Clara, walked alone, the hem of her skirt heavy with mud. She carried nothing but a candle stub wrapped in cloth, a keepsake she'd refused to leave behind. When she reached the hill where the Brackley house once stood, she stopped. What had once been white was now grey and eaten by vines. The roof sagged inward, and the windows were hollow, staring out like sockets. The piano's shape still sat inside, warped and half sunken into the rotted floor. She felt her throat tighten. Every creak of the old wood sounded like her name being remembered. Seline stepped through the doorway. Her shoes crunched on the glass that had once been part of the grand mirror, now dulled and black with age. The air was thick and cold, and yet beneath it all, she thought she could still smell candle wax and rain. She found the parlour just as she remembered it. The wallpaper hung loose in strips, the air tasted like iron, and the piano waited in the corner like a body at rest. For a long time she said nothing. Then, softly, "Clara?" The house didn't answer, but the wind shifted through the open rafters, moving the dust in small circles. She approached the piano and touched the keys. The first note barely sounded. The second rang clear, higher than she expected. Then, somewhere deep in the instrument, another key depressed itself, one she hadn't touched. Seline's hand froze. A low hum rose from the wood. Not a ghostly sound, not a voice, just vibration, the faint heartbeat of something left behind. Her eyes filled. "I thought you'd gone." She sat down and began to play the same tune her sister had played the night of the storm. Her hands shook, but the melody carried. As she played, the house seemed to breathe with her, the wind moving in rhythm through the broken shutters, the boards groaning like tired lungs. When she finished, she pressed her hand flat on the wood. "I carried your name," she whispered. "You carried the silence." For the first time in years, she felt whole. She rose and set her candle on the piano. The wax pooled slowly as the flame bent sideways in the draught. She turned toward the door, but before leaving, she looked once more at the broken mirror on the wall. In its cracked surface, she saw two women standing, one in light, one in shadow. For a moment, they moved together, as they always had. Then the reflection blinked, and only one remained. Outside, the wind carried a single note through the cane fields, faint and low, as if the house itself was sighing in relief. By the time Seline, still calling herself Clara, reached town again, her hands were trembling, raw from the cold. The few people who passed her on the road turned to stare. They whispered to each other, not because they recognized her, but because she looked like someone they'd heard of in stories told after dark. At the edge of the marketplace, two children were talking near a wagon fire. "My grandmama says the Brackley place still plays music at night," one said. "The wind plays it," the other answered. "No, she says it's the sister who never left Seline stopped walking. For a moment, she felt her lungs forget how to draw air. The story had lived without her. The widow she had once worked for didn't recognize her when she returned. "You look thin as a shadow," the woman said. "Where have you been?" "Visiting someone," Seline replied. "An old house." That night she couldn't sleep. The hum of the town, the laughter, the sound of the river, none of it felt real. Her hands ached for the keys, the wood, the way the piano had answered her like an old friend that never stopped waiting. By dawn, she knew what she had to do. She spent the next day gathering candles and scraps of paper. On each paper, she wrote a single line in her uneven script. 2 were sold. 1 spoke. 1 remembered. Then she folded them carefully, one by one, and left them around the town, in baskets of bread, under doors, inside hymn books at the church. She didn't sign them. She didn't have to. By evening, the whispers had started again. The market women said the echo ghost had walked among them. The preacher burned one of the notes in his hand, saying it was the work of the devil. But the children repeated the words like a rhyme. When she returned to her small rented room, Seline lit her last candle. She placed it on the windowsill the way she always had, the flame trembling in the humid air. Outside, the wind from the south began to rise again. "I kept the promise," she whispered. "They'll remember us now." She closed her eyes. The candle burned down to a pool of wax. The next morning, the room was empty, her things neatly folded on the bed. But on the floor near the window was a handprint, faint, white and perfectly shaped, pressed into the boards as if made by dust and time. Within a week, people in town started saying the music had changed. It was softer now, slower, more human. Some said it sounded like two voices finally breathing together, the living and the remembered keeping time. And when the wind blew east toward the ruined house, it carried something like a song, a melody without words, built from everything the sisters had ever left unsaid. Years passed, and the Brackley place became a story parents told to hush their children before bed. The land around it changed, the fields overgrown, the house sinking deeper into its own decay. But the story stayed. It grew in the mouths of those who'd never seen the place, shaped by fear and fascination. They said the house had been built on cursed soil, that its master, proud and cruel, had tried to turn two sisters into one. That one spoke, and one stayed silent, until their voices bled into each other and drove him to madness. Every town had its own ending. In some, the twins had drowned him in the river, singing a hymn that made the water boil. In others, one had killed the other out of mercy, and her ghost returned each night to finish the song they never got to play. But the one thing every version agreed on was this. When the wind blew from the south, you could hear piano music across the fields, soft and uneven, like a heartbeat. Children dared each other to walk up the hill and touch the door. None stayed long. They said they could feel the floor move under their feet, breathing, remembering. Sometimes they'd find things left behind, a strip of lace, a broken candle stub, or scraps of paper with words that faded when touched. As years rolled into decades, the story slipped into folklore. Preachers warned against the twin temptation of pride and silence. Poets romanticized it. Two souls caught in a mirror, trapped by love and sin. and somewhere in between, truth thinned into myth. But the people who lived nearest to the ruins, those who passed the house every morning on their way to the river, knew something else. They said the house wasn't cursed, it was listening. One old woman, who claimed her grandmother had worked for the Brackleys, told it differently from the others. Her version didn't end in horror, but in quiet. They didn't haunt nobody, she'd say, rocking on her porch. They just stayed until someone heard 'em right. The wind don't moan for ghosts, it sings for the ones who weren't allowed to speak. By the turn of the century, the Brackley plantation was little more than a foundation of stone and weeds. But travellers still stopped there. Writers, preachers, strangers, looking for proof that stories left footprints. Some swore they saw two figures through the fog, one standing, one seated, both framed by the shape of a piano. When they tried to approach, the vision would fade into the grey. But the sound, faint and low, always stayed behind. It wasn't music anymore, it was something smaller, sadder, purer, like breath, like forgiveness. And when the last of the visitors left, the wind would pass through the house again, not wailing, not mourning, but whispering a single word in the dust: remember. In 1924, a folklorist named Elias Wren arrived in St. Mary Parish with a notebook, a camera, and a fascination for what he called songs that refuse to die. He had spent years collecting tales from the Louisiana Delta, ghost hymns, slave lullabies, stories whispered in the sugar fields when the wind turned cold. But the one that brought him here was older, harder to find. Locals called it the Echo Twins of Brackley Hill. When he first asked about it at the general store, the shopkeeper frowned. "You don't want that one," he said. "That house never stayed buried." Still, Elias went. The ruins were a day's walk through the cane. By the time he reached the hill, dusk was bleeding into the fields. The house was nearly gone, just the bones of it now. 2 chimneys, a half wall, a shadow of stairs leading nowhere. He unpacked his notebook and began to sketch. Every few minutes he paused, listening. The wind in the reeds had a rhythm to it, not quite random, almost measured. That night, he camped beside the house. The air was damp, humming with frogs and the creak of old trees. Around midnight, his candle flickered without cause. Then he heard it, a faint chord. He sat upright. The sound came from inside the ruin, soft and deliberate. 3 notes, then silence, then 2 more. He waited. The music didn't return. But when he looked down, his notebook, left open beside him, had new words on the page, written in a script not his own. One remembered. One was remembered. He closed the book, heart pounding, and didn't sleep again until dawn. The next morning, he explored the remains of the parlour. The piano was nothing but a husk now, its keys bone-white and brittle. The mirror had long since blackened, its shards buried under moss. But in the corner of the room, half hidden beneath vines, he found something, a wax imprint pressed into a floorboard. It looked like a handprint, small, feminine, perfectly preserved. Elias made a rubbing of it in charcoal, labelling it Artifact Number 47, the hand of the silent sister. Back in New Orleans, he tried to publish his findings. No one believed him. His peers called the handwriting pareidolia, a trick of light and fear. But the handprint troubled him. He'd kept it locked away in his drawer for years, and sometimes he swore he could still smell candle smoke when he touched it. In his final entry before his death in 1932, he wrote, "They say silence dies when no one listens. But I've heard a different kind of quiet, one that waits. The Brackley house is gone, but the air remembers the tune. And when the wind is low, it still hums the name of the one who stayed to keep the story breathing." That note was found beside his candle, burned down to the wick. And when the archivists opened his drawer, they found the wax handprint faintly warm, as if someone had just lifted their hand away. By the time half a century had passed, the story of the Brackley twins had slipped from history into folklore and from folklore into myth. Elias Wren's notes were found again in the 1970s by a graduate student cataloguing forgotten fieldwork from the early 20th century. Most of his recordings had decayed. His film reels were dust. But one page, pressed between old newspapers, had survived. On it, written in fading ink, was a single line. If you stand where the house once was and the wind is still, you can hear someone breathing behind you, and she breathes for both. The student, Mara Ellison, thought it was poetry. She didn't know that Wren had meant it literally. Curiosity led her to St. Mary Parish in the summer of 1975. The locals she met were tired of ghosts. They called her the girl chasing smoke. But when she mentioned the twins, something in their faces changed. A few turned away. One old woman spat on the ground and said, "They don't like to be called that. Call 'em what they were, the sisters who shared a name." Mara found the hill by following the river road, now overgrown with cypress and wild magnolia. Nothing of the house remained, not even the foundations. Only the earth, uneven and pale, as if something had once burned there and never cooled. She unpacked her recorder, set it on the grass, and waited. The wind came and went in long, uneven breaths. When dusk fell, she lit a candle. The flames swayed, not from the breeze, but from something nearer. The air around her shifted, heavy with scent, wax, rain, and something faintly sweet. And then came the sound, a single note, faint, metallic, like the echo of an instrument buried too deep to be real. She leaned forward, pressing record. The note came again, clearer this time, followed by a whisper that wasn't speech, but movement, the drag of fabric, the slow intake of air, the faint hum of a melody older than memory. She didn't run. She only said, "I hear you." The sound stopped. Then, softly, the candle bent backward, its flame leaning toward her instead of away. When she returned to New Orleans and played the tape, she found only static. But at the 30-second mark, the noise changed. Soft, rhythmic, unmistakable. A heartbeat. Then another. Then silence. She titled her thesis, "The Song Without a Singer, the Echo Legend of St. Mary Parish." It was published once, briefly, before the university archives flooded the next year. The flood destroyed the recording, the paper, the photographs, everything except one object, a wax imprint of a small hand sealed in a glass case. Visitors who've seen it claim that when the room is quiet enough, you can hear faint piano keys under the hum of the air conditioner, hesitant, sorrowful, but steady. And if you lean close, you can almost make out a whisper in the wax. One spoke. One remembered. And now you do too. Even now, when the air turns heavy before a storm, locals say you can feel the Brackley sisters somewhere in it, the air thickening just enough to make you pause, the silence bending before the first drop of rain. No one's quite sure when the hill stopped showing up on maps. Some say the parish paved over it, built a new road that swallowed the ground whole. Others swear they've seen the outline of the house in satellite photos, faint lines where no structure should be, a piano-shaped shadow caught in the grass. And sometimes, when the night is too still, when even the cicadas stop their song, the wind carries a sound that doesn't belong to the living. Not a cry, not a ghost's lament, just a low, steady hum, a lullaby that never learned how to end. People who've gone looking for the source all describe the same thing, a feeling of being watched, but gently, like someone behind them is waiting for them to listen. Those who stay long enough claim they've heard footsteps just behind their own, falling perfectly in rhythm. 2 steps, then 1, 2, then 1. Some leave offerings now, little things, lace ribbons, candles, half-burnt hymn pages, not to ward off evil, but to honor memory. The people here have learned that not every haunting asks to be feared. Some only want to be remembered correctly. And the story of the Brackley twins, the sisters who shared a name and a silence, has grown into something larger than horror. It's not about ghosts anymore. It's about the pieces we leave behind, the fragments that refuse to die because someone somewhere is still willing to listen. If you stand where their house once stood and whisper your own name into the wind, they say it comes back changed, softened, slower, like it's been carried by another voice. Some swear that voice sounds like theirs. Others say it sounds like yours. Maybe the difference doesn't matter, because stories like this don't end. They only find new mouths to speak them. So when you hear a song without words, when the air trembles for no reason, When you feel something remembering you before you remember it, listen closely. You might just hear two voices breathing in time, the one who spoke and the one who never stopped listening. If you've stayed with me through this story, through the silence, the echoes, and the house that still hums, make sure you subscribe to the Macabre Record. And in the comments, tell me, where are you listening from tonight? Because somewhere out there, the wind is still carrying names, and maybe the next one it whispers will be yours.